Welcome to my channel. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time together. So find a quiet place, lay down in your bed, and let your mind slow down. This is not just history, it's a soft journey into the past, a story to guide you gently into rest. Our topic tonight is the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941, a moment in history that changed the world forever. We'll explore the events of that morning, the lives it touched, and the legacy it left behind. There's no need to do anything, no likes, no shares, no subscriptions. Just let your eyes grow heavy, breathe deeply, and allow the story to carry you. Now, let's begin our journey into history and into sleep. It is December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. The sky is a brilliant blue. The air is warm and still. For the people of Pearl Harbor, it's just another day in paradise. Many are sleeping late, enjoying the tranquility of the island. Others are at church, their voices mingling with the soft strains of the organ. Children are playing, dogs are barking, and the gentle lull of life carries on. But this peaceful scene is about to change. In a few hours, the lives of everyone here will be irrevocably altered. Suddenly, the calm is shattered by the roar of engines. People rush to their windows and look up. In the sky, two Japanese fighter planes scream overhead, followed by another and another. They fly in tight formation, their wings almost touching as they head towards the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. As they approach, bombs are released and the tranquility of the island is replaced by chaos and destruction. Explosions rock the harbor as bombs detonate, sending huge plumes of smoke into the air. People run for cover as flames engulf buildings and ships. It's a scene of utter devastation. And amidst the chaos, the realization dawns: this is an attack, a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base. As the Japanese planes continue their assault, more bombs fall, causing even more damage and destruction. The attack is relentless and the Americans are caught off guard. The harbor, once a scene of peace and beauty, is now a chaotic nightmare. Amidst the destruction, the Americans fight back. Anti-aircraft guns blaze, but the Japanese planes keep coming. After 2 hours of intense bombing, the Japanese planes finally retreat, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. The attack on Pearl Harbor has begun. As the smoke clears, the full extent of the damage becomes apparent. Battleships are sunk or ablaze, the airbase is destroyed, and the harbor is littered with debris. The attack has caught the Americans off guard, and the loss of life and destruction is staggering. But amidst the devastation, there is also heroism. Stories of bravery and selflessness emerge as people come together to help each other in the face of this national tragedy. The attack on Pearl Harbor has not only shaken the nation, but has also awakened a sense of unity and determination. As the sun sets on Pearl Harbor that day, the Americans are left reeling from the shock of the attack, but they are also filled with a sense of resolve. They will rebuild and they will fight back. The attack has brought them together as a nation, and they are ready to face whatever challenges lie ahead. And so our journey ends here, friends. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the events that unfolded at Pearl Harbor on that fateful day in 1941. If you'd like to learn more about this pivotal moment in history, we encourage you to do further research. As you continue to explore this topic, you'll uncover more stories of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience that defined this event. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding our history can help us build a better future. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep seeking out the truth. Until next time, sleep well and dream peacefully. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the sun rose over the Hawaiian Islands, much like it had countless times before. The skies above Oahu were painted with soft strokes of pink and orange, and the waves of the Pacific Ocean rolled gently onto the sandy shores. To many, it felt like just another peaceful Sunday in paradise. The island was alive with the smells of salt water and blooming hibiscus, and most people had little idea that within hours, the world they knew would be changed forever. Hawaii, at the time, was still a U.S. territory, not yet a state. Its beauty and location in the heart of the Pacific made it both a treasured outpost and a strategic military necessity. Pearl Harbor, nestled on the southern coast of Oahu, served as the main base for the United States Pacific Fleet. It was a place of bustling military activity, ships anchored neatly in rows, aircraft stationed at nearby airfields, and sailors moving about with the routine of discipline and duty. Yet despite its importance, few expected it to become the site of one of the most infamous attacks in modern history. To understand Pearl Harbor's story, we need to step back and place ourselves in the world of 1941. The United States had not yet entered World War II. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already engulfed in flames. Britain stood nearly alone in its resistance, fighting desperately to hold back the tide of fascism. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan had been expanding aggressively for years, seizing territories in China and eyeing further control across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. America, at this point, was walking a tightrope between involvement and isolation. Many Americans still remembered the horrors of World War I and wanted no part in another overseas conflict. The U.S. government maintained a policy of neutrality, though in practice, it was quietly supplying weapons and resources to Britain and its allies. Tensions with Japan, however, were growing steadily. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and political clashes had created a storm beneath the surface, one that was about to erupt. But on the ground in Hawaii, most people weren't focused on geopolitics. For sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor, Sunday was often a day of rest. Some were just waking up, others were preparing for breakfast, and a few lucky ones had been granted shore leave to enjoy the island's beaches, cafes, and nightlife. Families lived in military housing nearby, children played under the palm trees, and Hawaiian locals went about their daily routines. The mood was relaxed. There was no sense of imminent danger. The harbor itself was calm, a massive lagoon encircled by land, with narrow channels leading out to the ocean. Battleships like the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and USS West Virginia rested quietly in the waters, gleaming under the tropical sun. These ships were considered symbols of American power, steel giants, meant to deter any enemy that might threaten the Pacific. To those who looked at them, Pearl Harbor felt like an impenetrable fortress, yet behind the beauty and calm, storm clouds were gathering. Thousands of miles away, in Japan, military leaders were finalizing one of the most daring surprise attacks in history. Pilots were preparing, fleets were mobilizing, and orders had been given to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet with devastating force. Unbeknownst to the men and women living their normal lives on Oahu, the countdown had already begun. History often has these moments, times when everything seems ordinary. But beneath the surface, the world is on the verge of something extraordinary. December 7th, 1941, began as a day like any other. But it would end as a turning point, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would later call it a date which will live in infamy, and indeed, it has. Before we step into the chaos of the attack itself, it is important to linger in this moment of stillness. To imagine the island before the explosions. To picture the sailors laughing over breakfast, the families gathering for church, and the pilots at nearby airfields performing routine checks without the slightest suspicion of what was coming. This calm before the storm is vital. It reminds us that behind every event in history are real people, living their lives unaware of the shadows looming over them. Pearl Harbor was more than a military base. It was a community, a place where young men in crisp uniforms wrote letters home, where wives prepared Sunday meals, where children ran barefoot across the grass. It was a world suspended between peace and war, and in the span of just 2 hours, everything would be shattered. This is where our story begins, not with bombs and fire, but with a quiet morning in Hawaii, a place of beauty and tranquility that was about to be forever etched into history. Background build-up. To understand why Japan struck Pearl Harbor, we have to zoom out and look at the broader world stage in the late 1930s and early 1940s. History rarely happens in isolation. The bombs that fell on Oahu that morning were the result of decades of ambition, rivalry, and mounting tension. Japan's rise in the Pacific. In the early 20th century, Japan was undergoing a remarkable transformation. Once an isolated island nation, Japan had modernized rapidly after the mid-1800s, adopting Western-style industry, technology, and military practices. By the early 1900s, it was emerging as a major power, eager to expand its influence in Asia. The first signs of this ambition were clear in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, where Japan shocked the world by defeating Russia. It was the first time an Asian power had defeated a European one in modern warfare. The victory announced Japan's arrival on the global stage. From there, Japan's appetite grew. By the 1930s, the Japanese government and military had set their sights on a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was essentially Japan's plan to dominate Asia and the Pacific, securing resources and territory to fuel its industrial and military ambitions. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, establishing a puppet state called Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but little was done to stop it. Emboldened, Japan pushed further into China. By 1937, it launched a full-scale invasion, resulting in brutal atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. Japan's hunger for resources, oil, rubber, steel, and food was driving this aggression. As an island nation with limited natural resources, it depended heavily on imports. Conquering territories in Southeast Asia offered the promise of self-sufficiency and power. America's position on the other side of the Pacific. The United States was watching these developments with increasing concern. The U.S. had its own long history of involvement in the Pacific. From the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 to the acquisition after the Spanish-American War, American leaders saw Japan's expansion not only as a threat to regional stability, but also as a direct challenge to U.S. influence in the Pacific. At first, however, America's response was cautious. The country was still reeling from the Great Depression of the 1930s, and many Americans wanted to avoid foreign entanglements. The horrors of World War I were still fresh, and isolationist sentiment was strong. But as Japan continued its march through Asia, U.S. patience began to thin. Economic sanctions and rising tensions. The United States chose to fight Japan not with guns, at least not yet, but with economics. In 1940, after Japan occupied French Indochina, Washington began restricting exports of vital materials like scrap metal and aviation fuel to Japan. Then, in July 1941, when Japan moved further into Southeast Asia, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and, most importantly, cut off oil exports. This was a devastating blow. At the time, about 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. Without oil, Japan's Navy and Air Force would grind to a halt. The embargo placed Japan in a desperate position: either back down and lose face or find another way to secure the resources it needed. For Japan's leaders, the answer seemed clear. They turned their eyes southward, toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia, Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. But there was one enormous obstacle in their way: the United States Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor. The road to conflict as 1941 progressed. Negotiations between the United States and Japan grew increasingly tense. Washington demanded that Japan withdraw from China and end its expansion, but Tokyo refused. Japanese leaders felt cornered, convinced that America was deliberately trying to choke their nation into submission. In private meetings, Japan's military strategists debated their options. They believed that if they struck swiftly and decisively, they could cripple the Pacific Fleet, seize the territories they wanted, and then negotiate from a position of strength. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. Europe's war and America's balancing act. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another storm was raging. World War II was already in full swing. Germany had conquered much of Europe, and Britain was under relentless bombardment in the Blitz. The Soviet Union, after being invaded by Hitler in June 1941, was now fighting for its survival. The United States was walking a fine line. Officially, it was neutral. In practice, it was edging closer to war, supplying Britain with weapons and materials through the Lend-Lease Act. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that a global conflict was inevitable, but he also knew that the American public was not yet ready to commit to another war. Japan's leaders watched this situation carefully. They believed that America, distracted by Europe, would be hesitant to fully engage in the Pacific. If Japan could strike a crippling blow at Pearl Harbor, it might buy the time needed to consolidate its conquests. A dangerous gamble. By late 1941, the decision was made. Japan would launch a surprise attack against the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The goal was simple: destroy America's battleships, disable its aircraft carriers, and eliminate its ability to interfere in Japan's expansion. It was a bold gamble. If it worked, Japan could dominate the Pacific. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. And so, even as life in Hawaii carried on with its usual rhythm of beaches, palm trees, and military drills across the ocean, Japanese aircraft carriers were preparing to sail. Pilots were training for their mission. War was coming, and Pearl Harbor was the target. Life at Pearl Harbor. Before the attack, to understand the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, it helps to step into the shoes of those who were there. Not as soldiers in the middle of battle, but as ordinary men and women living out their daily lives on the eve of the attack. A military hub in Paradise, Pearl Harbor was more than just a naval base. It was a small city in its own right. Nestled on the southern shore of Oahu, the harbor stretched like a giant lagoon, connected to the ocean by narrow channels. The water inside was calm and sheltered, making it an ideal home for America's Pacific Fleet. In late 1941, the harbor was packed with battleships, destroyers, cruisers, and support vessels. Towering steel giants lined Battleship Row, where ships like the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and USS West Virginia rested at anchor. At nearby airfields, Hickam Wheeler, UA, and Kaneo rows of aircraft sat neatly parked, their silver fuselages glinting under the Hawaiian sun. It looked like strength. It looked like security. Too many Americans stationed there. Pearl Harbor felt impenetrable. Life on base for the sailors, soldiers, and airmen. Life at Pearl Harbor was a mix of strict routine and occasional leisure. Mornings often began with reveille, the sharp call to rise and begin the day. Uniform inspections, training drills, and ship maintenance filled much of the schedule. There were also sports leagues, movie nights, dances, and trips into Honolulu for shore leave. On the weekend of December 6th to 7th, 1941, the mood was especially relaxed. It was a Saturday night leading into a Sunday morning, and many servicemen had gone into town to enjoy themselves. Honolulu offered bars, restaurants, and music halls. Sailors might dance to swing music, share a drink with friends, or write letters home to loved ones. For those who stayed on base, Saturday night was quieter but no less social. Games of poker or cards broke out in the barracks. Radios hummed with music and baseball broadcasts. In mess halls, men traded stories, laughed, and teased each other. Everyone knew Monday would bring another week of drills, but for now, they were content to enjoy a peaceful weekend. Families and civilians. It wasn't just military personnel who called Pearl Harbor home. Many families lived in nearby housing communities. Officers brought their wives and children with them to Hawaii, creating a lively family atmosphere. Children played in the yards, rode bikes, and swam in the warm waters of the island. Mothers shopped in Honolulu markets, prepared meals, and formed friendships with neighbors. For Hawaiian civilians, life was its usual rhythm. Farmers tended sugarcane and pineapple fields. Fishermen set out early in the morning. Locals ran cafes, shops, and small businesses that catered to both islanders and servicemen. There was some awareness of global tensions, but for most, war felt far away. Signs of tension, but little alarm. Of course, there were subtle signs that all was not entirely calm. Military intelligence had picked up hints of Japanese aggression. Some commanders worried about sabotage or surprise attack, though most assumed that if Japan struck, it would be in the Philippines or elsewhere in Asia, not in Hawaii, which lay more than 4,000 miles from Japan. Even so, precautions were minimal. At airfields, American planes were parked close together, an attempt to guard against sabotage on the ground. But a disastrous formation if an air raid were to come. Many sailors kept ammunition locked away, not expecting to need it on a quiet Sunday morning. The Pacific Fleet was at anchor, in perfect rows, impressive to look at, but vulnerable to attack. The last peaceful night on the evening of December 6, 1941. As the sun set over Oahu, the scene was almost idyllic. The Pacific waves shimmered with golden light. Couples walked along the beach, sailors strolled arm in arm with sweethearts, and families gathered for dinner. In the barracks, men lay on their bunks, reading letters from home or drifting off to sleep. At Hickam Field, pilots checked over their planes one last time before heading to bed. At Pearl Harbor, officers reviewed logs, then turned in for the night. The hum of the island quieted as stars filled the tropical sky. No one could have imagined that, even as they slept, across the ocean, a Japanese strike force was already on its way. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and thousands of men preparing for a mission that would change the world. The morning routine. When dawn broke on Sunday, December 7, 1941, Oahu woke slowly. It was a day of rest. Some sailors rose early to attend church services. Others slept in after a Saturday night out. Families made breakfast, children played outside, and officers sipped coffee on porches overlooking the harbor. At 7 a.m., the scene was calm. The battleships lay still in the water. Sailors were eating in the mess hall. Some men were preparing for a leisurely day off, perhaps heading into Honolulu later. For many, it was the first real break they'd had in weeks. It was a beautiful morning, clear skies, warm breeze, and the scent of salt air drifting across the island. It was also the last morning of peace. Within less than an hour, that calm would be shattered by the roar of aircraft engines, the thunder of explosions, and the cries of men caught in chaos. But for this moment, the final quiet before the storm, Pearl Harbor remained what it had always been, a place of community, duty, and life. A place unprepared for the violence about to descend upon it. Planning the attack war doesn't just erupt out of nowhere. Even surprise attacks are carefully built, brick by brick, through strategy, intelligence, and daring gambles. The attack on Pearl Harbor was no exception. Behind those 2 fateful hours on December 7, 1941, lay months of planning, secrecy, and a bold vision that seemed impossible to many military minds at the time. The decision in Tokyo. By mid-1941, Japan's leaders had reached a breaking point. The U.S. oil embargo threatened to cripple their economy and military. Without oil, their navy would grind to a halt. Yet surrendering to U.S. demands, pulling out of China, and halting expansion was unthinkable. So Japan's war cabinet debated a desperate choice: either yield to American pressure or fight for dominance in Asia. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the military high command leaned toward war. Their plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Launch a lightning strike against the United States, cripple its Pacific Fleet, and then seize territories across Southeast Asia before America could recover. It was a gamble based on time. Japan believed that if it could gain control quickly, the United States would negotiate peace rather than endure a long, bloody conflict far from its shores. Admiral Yamamoto's vision, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was no ordinary officer. He had studied in the United States, attended Harvard, and even spent time in Washington as a naval. He admired American industry and knew the U.S. was far stronger than Japan in the long run. Privately, Yamamoto was reluctant about war. He once warned, in the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Great Britain, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Yet, if war was inevitable, Yamamoto argued, it had to begin with a crushing blow. He proposed something radical: a surprise air attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. If America's battleships and carriers could be destroyed in a single strike, Japan would have the freedom to conquer the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. It was daring, it was risky, but Yamamoto believed it was Japan's only chance. The secret plan. In early 1941, Yamamoto's staff began drawing up the details of the operation. It would be one of the most complex naval missions in history. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku would sail in complete secrecy across thousands of miles of open ocean. From their decks, more than 350 aircraft would launch in waves, striking Pearl Harbor at dawn. The plan had 3 goals: destroy U.S. battleships and cruisers at anchor, cripple American air power by bombing airfields, target aircraft carriers if present. If successful, the attack would neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet for months, giving Japan a free hand to seize resource-rich colonies. Secrecy was paramount. Few outside the planning circle knew the details. Orders were disguised. Communications were strictly controlled. To the world, it would look as if Japan was still negotiating with the United States. Training for the strike. The operation required precision. Japanese pilots spent months practicing bombing runs, torpedo attacks, and dive bombing techniques. One of the biggest challenges was Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Conventional wisdom said torpedoes dropped from planes would simply sink into the mud before hitting ships. To solve this, Japanese engineers modified the torpedoes with wooden fins, stabilizing them so they could run in shallow water. It was a simple, yet brilliant, innovation, one that made the attack possible. Pilots also rehearsed bombing runs on models of Pearl Harbor, memorizing the layout of Battleship Row and the positions of airfields. They drilled relentlessly until muscle memory guided their actions. By the autumn of 1941, the strike force was ready. The journey begins. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike fleet left its home waters under the command of Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo. It was the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. The ships sailed north into the cold waters of the Pacific, avoiding common shipping routes. Absolute radio silence was enforced. No messages sent, no signals given. Meanwhile, Japanese diplomats in Washington continued negotiations with American officials. The talks were, in reality, little more than a smokescreen. While diplomats spoke of peace, the carriers pressed onward through icy seas, aiming for a rendezvous point 230 miles north of Oahu. Warnings ignored back in the United States. There were faint signals of danger, but they went largely unnoticed. American intelligence had broken some Japanese codes, revealing that Tokyo was preparing for action. There were warnings that Japan might strike, but most assumed the target would be in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Even on Oahu itself, the signs were missed. On the night of December 6th, radar operators would spot incoming aircraft, but their warnings would be brushed aside as friendly planes. Fate, it seemed, was aligning for the attackers. The gamble of a lifetime for the men aboard the Japanese carriers. The voyage across the Pacific was a tense and silent one. Pilots wrote letters home, unsure if they would survive. Officers studied maps of Oahu by lamplight. Every sailor knew they were part of something historic, a strike that could secure Japan's future or plunge it into disaster. By December 6th, the fleet had reached its final position. Engines idled, planes were readied, and orders were given. The attack would come at dawn on Sunday, December 7th. The world was on the brink of a new chapter. In less than 24 hours, Pearl Harbor would transform from a place of peace into a battlefield of fire and steel. The morning of December 7th, 1941, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, began like any other day in Hawaii. The island of Oahu awoke to a quiet dawn, the sky painted in soft shades of gold and pink. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the Pacific across palm-lined streets, and the waters of Pearl Harbor shimmered in the early light. For the people living there, it was a day of rest, a Sunday meant for church, leisure, and calm. The routine of a Sunday morning at 6 a.m., Pearl Harbor was still sleepy. Some sailors stirred from their bunks, stretching and rubbing their eyes after late nights of poker or shore leave in Honolulu. Others remained sound asleep, enjoying the luxury of a Sunday morning without drills. The smell of breakfast eggs, bacon, coffee drifted through the mess halls of the great battleships anchored in the harbor. For many, it was an ordinary day. Some sailors polished their shoes and uniforms for inspection later in the week. Others planned to meet friends in town, perhaps to attend church services or visit the beaches of Waikiki. Across Oahu, the military airfields also lay in slumber. At Wheeler Airfield, Hickam Field, and UA rows of aircraft sat neatly parked, their wings glinting in the sun. Ground crews performed light checks, but no one expected trouble. After all, Hawaii was thousands of miles from Japan. If war came, most believed it would be in the Philippines or perhaps far off, Southeast Asia. Not here, not today. The radar blip that didn't matter at around 7 a.m. Two young radar operators at Opana Station, on the northern tip of Oahu, detected a massive formation of incoming aircraft. Startled, they quickly reported it to the duty officer at headquarters, but the warning was dismissed. A group of US B-17 bombers was expected from California that morning, and the officer assumed the radar return was simply those planes arriving. It was a fatal mistake. The radar screen hadn't shown American bombers, it had shown the first wave of Japanese attack planes, hundreds strong, closing in fast. The Japanese strike force prepares. Meanwhile, 230 miles north of Oahu, aboard 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, the air crews were already awake and busy. Pilots tightened their flight suits, adjusted goggles, and climbed into cockpits. Deck crews rushed to line up aircraft on the carrier's flight decks. Engines roared to life, one by one, as the order was given to prepare for takeoff. The first wave consisted of 183 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Their mission was to strike the battleships of Pearl Harbor and the American airfields, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single blow. At around 6 a.m., Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo gave the order. All squadrons, take off. One by one, the aircraft lifted from the carriers and soared into the dark blue sky, heading south toward Oahu. The ocean beneath them was calm, the horizon clear. Pilots tightened their grips on the controls, some whispering quiet prayers. They knew they carried the fate of Japan on their wings. Back in Hawaii, on Oahu, the world still looked peaceful. In Honolulu, streetcars rattled along their tracks. Newspapers printed headlines about events in Europe, the ongoing war across the Atlantic, and negotiations between Japan and the United States. But there was no alarm, no sense of danger. On Battleship Row, the mighty USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS California, and others lay motionless. Some sailors lounged on deck, enjoying the early sunshine. Others leaned against railings, chatting casually. The harbor waters were still, reflecting the silhouettes of the great ships like a mirror. Chapels on base began to fill with worshippers. In kitchens, cooks cracked eggs into frying pans. In barracks, sleepy men tied bootlaces, wrote letters home, or played cards while waiting for breakfast call. The island was calm, the air warm and sweet. For most, it was just another morning in paradise. The final approach by 7:30 a.m. The Japanese strike force had reached the northern coast of Oahu. Flying low over the ocean, they crossed the shoreline and swung south toward their targets. The lush green mountains of Hawaii rose beneath them. The pilots could now see the island laid out before them, fields, hangars, ships anchored in neat rows. The sun glinted off the Pacific, dazzling their eyes for a moment. Then the harbor came into view. There it was, PearlHarbor.com, unguarded, unsuspecting. The American fleet, the pride of U.S. naval power, lay directly below, perfectly arranged for destruction. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, leading the first wave, looked down and saw the opportunity he had trained for. Reaching for his radio, he shouted the coded words to his men. Tora, Tora, Tora. The message meant, we have achieved complete surprise, the last seconds of peace. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs began to fall, but in that brief moment before impact, Oahu was still at peace. Children laughed as they chased each other outside. A sailor scribbled a letter to his mother. A young pilot at Wheeler Field joked with a buddy before climbing into his trainer plane. On the deck of the USS Arizona, men leaned against railings, unaware of the danger descending from the sky. The calm was seconds away from being shattered. Paradise was about to become a battlefield. The attack unfolds. The first wave strikes. 7:48 a.m. The silence of Oahu shattered in an instant. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese planes swooped down, their engines screaming through the Hawaiian sky. The attack began with a thunderous explosion as bombs and torpedoes fell upon Wheeler Field and Hickam Air Base, targeting American aircraft on the ground. Rows of us planes lined up neatly, wingtip to wingtip to wingtip, erupted in flames. Hangars crumbled as bombs tore through steel and concrete. Pilots and ground crews scrambled desperately, some running toward their aircraft, others diving for cover. For many, it was too late. Their planes were destroyed before they ever left the ground. At that same moment, torpedo bombers skimmed the waters of Pearl Harbor, their low-flying silhouettes barely above the waves. Their targets, the battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, moored along what was known as Battleship Row. The battleships under fire. The first torpedoes slammed into the sides of the USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia. The explosions tore massive holes into their hulls, sending water rushing in. Within minutes, the Oklahoma began to capsize, rolling onto its side as sailors scrambled for their lives. On the USS Arizona, men were just beginning their morning routines when disaster struck. At 8:06 a.m., a Japanese bomb pierced the ship's forward deck and ignited the ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. Fireballs shot skyward, sending a thunderous shockwave across the harbor. Over 1,100 men were killed instantly. The Arizona sank where she rested, engulfed in flames, becoming a tomb for her crew. Nearby, the USS California and USS Nevada also took torpedo hits. The Nevada, struggling under fire, attempted to get underway and make it out of the harbor, but as Japanese dive bombers targeted her, the Nevada ran aground to prevent blocking the channel. Chaos in the air above the harbor, Japanese Zero fighters swooped low, strafing anything that moved with trucks, hangars, even men running for cover. Bullets tore across the base roads, kicking up dirt and sparks. With no time to prepare, they ripped open ammunition boxes and began firing wildly into the sky. A few lucky hits managed to bring down Japanese planes, their wreckage crashing into fields and buildings, but the swarm was overwhelming. In the first half hour, the Japanese dominated the air, raining destruction on every corner of Oahu's defenses. Hickam and Wheeler Fields. At Hickam Field, giant plumes of smoke rose as hangars collapsed into smoldering ruins. Bombs tore apart runways, cradling them beyond use. Fire crews fought desperately to contain the blazes, but the infernos consumed everything. Fuel tanks exploded, trucks flipped, and planes burned like torches. At Wheeler Field, American pilots tried to fight back. A handful of men managed to reach their fighters before the bombs struck. Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor famously scrambled to their P-40 Warhawks, taking off under fire. Against impossible odds, they shot down several Japanese planes, becoming two of the first American heroes of the war. The human stories of panic and bravery. All across Pearl Harbor, chaos unfolded in ways both tragic and heroic. On the USS West Virginia, sailors fought to control flooding, dragging wounded shipmates through rising water. Many trapped below decks, pounded on bulkheads, desperate to escape as their ship sank. On the USS Arizona, survivors crawled through burning oil slicks on the water's surface, their clothes and skin aflame, struggling to swim to safety. Nurses at the Naval Hospital worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded inside, their white uniforms soaked in blood and smoke. Beds filled instantly, and operating rooms overflowed with casualties. Even ordinary civilians were caught in the nightmare. In Honolulu, stray bombs and bullets struck neighborhoods. Some families huddled under tables, not knowing what was happening, fearing an invasion of the island itself. The oil fires as battleships burned, Thick black smoke rose into the sky, so dense it blotted out the sun. The harbor waters turned into a hellish scene covered with burning oil, flames dancing across the waves. Survivors swimming for their lives had to push through fire, choking on smoke as they gasped for air. The inferno created an apocalyptic landscape. Men shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the roar of explosions. Sirens wailed. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts, sending shards of metal flying. The second wave, 8:54 a.m., just as the defenders began to recover from the first blow. A second wave of 171 Japanese aircraft descended. This wave focused on shipyards, dry docks, and additional targets in the harbor. Bombs rained down on Fort Island, and dive bombers screamed toward the remaining battleships. Though defenses were now more awake, it was still devastating. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with bursts of flak, but the Japanese pilots pressed on. More ships took damage. The USS Pennsylvania, USS Maryland, and USS Tennessee all suffered hits. The carnage lasted until nearly 10 o'clock a.m., by the time the Japanese planes finally turned back toward their carriers. Pearl Harbor was unrecognizable. Battleships lay capsized or burning. Aircraft lay in twisted heaps. Smoke poured skyward in massive columns, the toll of the attack in just under 2 hours. The Japanese had inflicted staggering damage. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, including the Arizona and Oklahoma. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans killed, and another 1,000 wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 planes. The attack was a triumph of planning and surprise for Japan, but its full consequences were yet to come. The immediate aftermath, the silence after the storm. By 10 a.m., the skies over Pearl Harbor were eerily quiet again. The Japanese planes had vanished back toward the horizon, leaving behind only smoke, fire, and devastation. What remained was a stunned silence, broken only by the crackling of flames, the cries of the wounded, and the groans of collapsing steel. The defenders, still clutching their weapons, were left in disbelief. In less than 2 hours, paradise had been transformed into a graveyard. The scene at Battleship Row, the heart of Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row, was a scene of almost unimaginable destruction. The USS Arizona was gone, her broken hull, still burning, columns of black smoke rising so high they could be seen across the island. For survivors who escaped, the reality was unbearable. They had lost not just their ship, but their entire crew, their brothers in arms. The USS Oklahoma lay on her side, capsized with hundreds of sailors trapped inside. From within the overturned hull, desperate banging could be heard as men pounded against the steel bulkheads, begging for rescue. Some of those trapped would survive for days, while rescuers worked frantically with cutting torches to free them. Others would never make it out. The USS Nevada, beached after her valiant attempt to escape, sat battered and scarred. Smoke poured from her deck, but her flag still flew, a symbol that not everything had been lost. For many sailors who survived, their immediate instinct was not to rest, but to return to the inferno and try to save others. Men dove into the harbor's oil-slicked waters to drag shipmates to safety. Others ran across decks littered with burning wreckage to pull wounded comrades out of danger. Hospital chaos. At the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor, the wounded began arriving by the truckload and boatload. Doctors and nurses were overwhelmed almost instantly. Operating tables filled within minutes. Hallways became makeshift triage zones. Blood stained every available surface as surgeons worked without pause. With supplies running out, some nurses tore their own sheets into bandages. Others worked with burned hands and smoke-filled lungs, refusing to rest as wave after wave of casualties came through the doors. Stories of incredible bravery emerged. Nurses carried wounded men on their backs through flames. Doctors performed surgeries while bombs were still falling. Young corpsmen, many barely out of school, found themselves suddenly responsible for keeping dozens of men alive. The oil-filled harbor. The harbor itself was a nightmare. Thick, burning oil covered the surface of the water. Survivors who jumped in to escape the flames found themselves swimming through fire. Many emerged, coated in black oil, coughing, their eyes burned raw by smoke. Small boats, launches, and even canoes joined the rescue efforts, pulling survivors from the water. Some sailors swam from ship to ship, helping others escape even as the wreckage around them exploded. For many survivors, the haunting image they would never forget was the sea itself on fire, men screaming as they tried to push through it, some disappearing beneath the waves. Civilians in shock across Oahu. Civilians were left dazed by what they had witnessed. Families in Honolulu had seen the smoke rising over the harbor, felt the explosions shake their windows, and heard the thunder of gunfire. Some had even been hit by stray bombs and bullets. Children clung to their parents, asking questions no one could answer. Rumors spread of a full Japanese invasion, that troops might be landing on the beaches at any moment. Grocery stores were flooded with panicked buyers, people stocking up on food and water. Roads clogged with cars as civilians tried to flee inland. The Hawaiian population, many of them Japanese Americans, faced a new fear, suspicion. Within hours, whispers of sabotage and espionage spread. Even though most Japanese Americans were as shocked and horrified as their neighbors. Acts of heroism, amid the chaos, countless stories of courage unfolded on the USS West Virginia. Lieutenant Commander Dory Miller, a black mess attendant with no formal gunnery training, carried wounded sailors to safety and then manned an anti-aircraft gun, firing at attacking planes until he ran out of ammunition. His bravery would later earn him the Navy Cross, the first African American to receive it. At Hickam Field, firefighters drove directly into burning hangars, battling infernos while bombs still fell around them. At Ford Island, sailors formed bucket brigades to douse flames, even as fuel tanks exploded nearby. Ordinary men and women became heroes simply by refusing to abandon their comrades. The emotional toll by midday, the full scope of the tragedy began to sink in. Families gathered outside the hospital, desperate for news of loved ones. Survivors walked in shock, their uniforms shredded, faces blackened with soot and oil. Some stared blankly at the ruins of their ships, unable to process the loss. Priests and chaplains moved through the devastation, giving last rites to the dying. Flags were lowered to half-staff. The island of Oahu was no longer a peaceful paradise, had become the front line of a war that had just begun. Rescue and recovery efforts throughout the afternoon and into the night. Rescue efforts continued. Teams worked tirelessly to cut into the hull of the capsized Oklahoma, but every success was paired with grim discoveries of men who hadn't made it. Divers searched through wreckage, pulling out bodies and survivors alike. On land, civilians donated blood in massive numbers. Churches and community halls became makeshift shelters for the displaced. Volunteers cooked food for the wounded and exhausted. The resilience of both civilians and military personnel became clear. Even in the darkest hour, the determination to recover, rebuild, and fight back burned strong. Night falls over Pearl Harbor. As night fell on December 7th, the fires still burned across Pearl Harbor. Columns of smoke rose into the starry Hawaiian sky. The smell of burning oil and steel lingered in the air. Sailors and soldiers stood watch, bracing for the possibility of another attack that never came. Sleep was impossible. Many sat silently, staring at the wreckage of their ships, grieving for friends who were gone. The words whispered that night summed up the collective feeling. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. The American response news reaches the mainland by the afternoon of December 7th. Word of the attack began reaching the mainland United States. Telegrams and radio broadcasts carried the shocking news. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor this morning. At first, many Americans didn't believe it. For years, rumors of war and scare stories had circulated, so people assumed this was just another false alarm. But as official confirmations rolled in, the shock turned to anger. Families with loved ones stationed in Hawaii crowded around radios, desperate for details. Newspapers rushed to print extra editions, their front pages screaming words like infamy, war, and disaster at Pearl Harbor. Across the country, theaters, churches, and public places suddenly fell silent as people listened to the radio. Strangers stopped one another in the streets, asking if they'd heard the news. America, once divided over whether to enter the war, was now united in disbelief and outrage. Roosevelt learns of the attack at the White House. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch when the news first arrived. An urgent phone call from the Navy reported the Japanese assault. Within minutes, more messages confirmed the scale of the devastation. Roosevelt.com Bud Grimm listened as his advisors described burning battleships, destroyed aircraft, and rising casualties. He immediately summoned his cabinet and military chiefs. Despite the shock, Roosevelt's mind was already racing toward the next step. For months, he had suspected Japan might strike somewhere, though most expected the Philippines or Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Still, he knew one thing for certain. This was war. Turning to his staff, Roosevelt spoke words that would soon echo across the nation. This is a day that will live in infamy. The War Council that evening, Roosevelt met with his closest advisors, including Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. They pored over reports as more grim details poured in: battleships sunk, planes destroyed, thousands killed or wounded. Roosevelt's decision was immediate. He would go to Congress the next morning and ask for a declaration of war. Some advisors raised concerns. Could Japan invade the West Coast? Would Germany and Italy join in? But Roosevelt was resolute. The time for hesitation had ended. America could no longer stand apart from the world's conflict. Public reaction back on the streets of America. The emotional reaction was overwhelming. Shock turned to fury. Ordinary citizens, who had once argued against joining the war, now demanded retaliation. Recruiting stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up around the block, eager to enlist and teach Japan a lesson. Factories prepared for wartime production, with workers realizing they would soon be building tanks, ships, and planes around the clock. Families wept as telegrams began to arrive, notifying them that sons, brothers, or husbands had been killed in the attack. In big cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, spontaneous rallies broke out. People waved flags, sang patriotic songs, and pledged loyalty to the nation. The attack had accomplished what years of debate had not. It united a divided country. December 8, 1941. Roosevelt's speech. On the morning of December 8, 1941, Roosevelt entered the U.S. Capitol to deliver one of the most famous speeches in American history. His words were clear, simple, and filled with righteous anger. He began, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." The chamber fell silent as Roosevelt described the dastardly attack, the loss of American lives, and the deliberate deception of Japan, which had still been engaged in peace talks in Washington even as its planes struck Pearl Harbor. He concluded with a demand. "I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Congress declares war." The response was immediate. Members of Congress, who had been fiercely divided over foreign policy, now stood almost completely united. In the Senate, the vote was 82-0 in favor of war. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 388-1. The lone dissenter was Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. Her vote was met with boos and scorn, but she stood firm on her principles. For everyone else, the path was clear. America was officially at war with Japan. Germany and Italy declare war. Just 3 days later, on December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini declared war on the United States. In response, Congress declared war on Germany and Italy the same day. The global conflict had now truly become World War II, with America fully engaged on both the Pacific and European fronts. The emotional impact for the American people. Roosevelt's speech was more than a declaration of war. It was a rallying cry. Families who had been divided over isolation versus intervention now stood together, committed to victory. Factories shifted overnight into wartime production. Men volunteered by the millions, and women prepared to take their place in the workforce. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant. Japan had hoped to cripple America's spirit, but instead, it had ignited it. A nation transformed. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of America accelerated. Civil defense drills were held in cities across the country, preparing for possible air raids. Japanese Americans began to face suspicion, anger, and prejudice, a dark chapter that would soon lead to mass internment. Propaganda posters and films urged Americans to conserve, ration, and support the war effort. Industry boomed as assembly lines cranked out ships, planes, and weapons at a pace the world had never seen. The United States, once hesitant to involve itself in foreign wars, now stood at the center of the greatest conflict in history. The lasting message, Roosevelt's phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," became etched into the American consciousness. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack on a military base, it was an attack on the very idea of safety, peace, and trust. And yet, out of that shock and sorrow came resolve. America was no longer a bystander. It was now a global power at war, determined to fight until victory was won. America responds. Shock turns to resolve. In the hours after the smoke began to clear over Pearl Harbor, a stunned nation tried to comprehend what had just happened. Radio stations across Hawaii transmitted urgent bulletins. Civilians rushed to hospitals to donate blood, while others lined up at recruiting offices. Newspapers hastily printed extra editions, their front pages screaming in bold letters, "Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, back on the U.S. mainland." Americans learned the news through radio broadcasts on that Sunday afternoon. Families gathered around their radios, holding their breath as announcers described the devastation in Hawaii. Shock, anger, and grief swept the country all at once. People had suspected war might come, but few thought it would arrive in such a brutal, sudden way. Mothers wept for their sons stationed in Hawaii. Fathers clenched their fists in frustration. For ordinary Americans, the attack made one thing clear. The United States could no longer remain on the sidelines of the World War. The War Cabinet convenes in Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt immediately summoned his War Cabinet and top military leaders. They gathered in the White House, grim-faced, listening to reports as they came in. Casualty numbers grew higher by the hour. Entire battleships had been destroyed. Airfields lay in ruins. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Roosevelt, though stricken with anger, remained calm and focused. He had been preparing for the possibility of war for months, but the scale of Pearl Harbor shocked even him. Still, he wasted no time. He knew he must act swiftly, both to reassure the American people and to demand justice from Congress. The day after Roosevelt's speech, on the morning of December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress. His speech would become one of the most famous in American history. With his voice steady but filled with controlled fury, he declared, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." The chamber was silent, the weight of history pressing on every word. Roosevelt went on to describe the treachery of the attack, noting that while Japan's diplomats were still negotiating in Washington, their navy had struck without warning. He promised that America would not only defend itself, but would ensure that such deceit would never succeed. The speech lasted just over 7 minutes, but its impact was immense. Congress responded with thunderous applause, and almost immediately afterward, they voted on a declaration of war against Japan. Only one member, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, lifelong pacifist, voted against it. The overwhelming majority reflected the unity of the American people. America enters the war with that vote. The United States formally entered World War II. For a nation that had debated for years whether to get involved in Europe's conflict, the choice was now clear. Isolationism was dead. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything. American factories, shipyards, and training camps sprang into action. Young men flooded enlistment centers, eager to fight. Posters declared, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The slogan became a rallying cry, a promise that the lives lost would not be in vain. The global shift. Japan had hoped that the attack would cripple America and buy time for its empire to expand across the Pacific. But instead, it awakened a sleeping giant. Within days, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States, and Roosevelt responded in kind. The world conflict was now truly global, with America fully committed. The Allies rejoiced. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, reportedly slept soundly the night after the attack, for the first time in months. He knew that with America's entry, the balance of the war had shifted. For the survivors back in Hawaii, the survivors of Pearl Harbor began the grim task of rescue and recovery. Divers searched the sunken ships for trapped sailors. Families buried their dead. The wrecks of battleships, like the USS Arizona, became watery tombs, still leaking oil that shimmered on the surface. For the survivors, the scars would last a lifetime, not only the burns and wounds, but the haunting memories of that morning of fire and chaos. Legacy and lessons. The turning point in World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than just a single event. It was a turning point in history. Before December 7, 1941, the United States had been divided, with many Americans hesitant about entering a foreign war. But the destruction in Hawaii shattered isolationist thinking overnight. From that moment on, America became the arsenal of democracy, mobilizing its vast industrial and human resources. Car factories began producing tanks and airplanes. Shipyards operated day and night, building new warships at a pace the world had never seen. Millions of young Americans joined the armed forces, determined to honor the memory of those who had died. Within months, the United States had transformed itself from a peacetime nation into a global military power, capable of fighting on two fronts, across Europe and across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a battle lost. It was the spark that launched a war America would eventually help win. Strategic lessons learned. Pearl Harbor also reshaped military strategy for the modern world. Before the attack, battleships were considered the kings of the seas. But the devastation showed that air power, especially carrier-based aircraft, could dominate naval warfare. The era of massive battleship fleets ended, replaced by the rise of aircraft carriers as the backbone of naval power. The attack also highlighted the dangers of complacency and underestimating an enemy. American commanders had not believed Japan would dare strike so boldly, so far from home. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate an opponent's determination or creativity. This thinking would later influence Cold War strategy and beyond. Remember Pearl Harbor, the rallying cry during the war years. Remember Pearl Harbor became more than just a phrase. It was a national mantra. It fueled recruitment, inspired propaganda, and kept American morale strong even in the darkest hours. Soldiers carried the memory of that Sunday morning into battle, whether on the beaches of Normandy or the jungles of the Pacific. The attack also reshaped American identity. It united the nation across political, social, and economic lines in a way few events ever had. For the first time, Americans from all backgrounds felt they were fighting not just for victory, but for survival. The human cost and resilience. More than 2,400 Americans were killed that morning, with another 1,100 wounded. Families were torn apart, and communities across the nation felt the weight of loss. But from that tragedy came resilience. Survivors, many of whom were grievously injured, continued to serve throughout the war. Their courage became symbols of American determination. The USS Arizona, which sank with over 1,100 men still aboard, became a permanent tomb and later a memorial. Even today, oil droplets, often called the tears of the Arizona, still rise to the surface of the harbor, reminding visitors of the lives lost. Pearl Harbor, in memory and culture. Over the decades, Pearl Harbor has remained etched into America's collective memory. Movies, books, documentaries, and personal accounts have kept the story alive for new generations. Survivors often spoke at schools and public events, sharing their memories to ensure that history would not be forgotten. Each year, on December 7th, Americans pause to reflect. Ceremonies are held at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii, where the white structure of the USS Arizona Memorial stretches gracefully across the sunken battleship. Veterans, families, and world leaders gather to honor the fallen and remember the cost of peace. A changed world order on a broader scale. Pearl Harbor permanently altered the balance of global power. By drawing the United States into World War II, it set the stage for America to emerge as a superpower in the post-war era. After 1945, the United States took on a leading role in rebuilding nations, establishing the United Nations, and shaping the world order. The attack also left a lasting scar on U.S.-Japan relations. In the short term, it fueled bitter hatred and a long, brutal Pacific War. But in the decades after, the two nations eventually forged an alliance. Today, Japan and the United States are close partners, a powerful reminder of how enemies can become allies through time and reconciliation. Lessons for the future. Pearl Harbor's legacy extends beyond history books. It serves as a cautionary tale about vigilance, preparedness, and the dangers of ignoring warnings. It teaches that surprise attacks can happen when least expected, and that nations must remain alert. It also shows the resilience of a people faced with tragedy. The attack intended to cripple America instead awakened its full strength. That lesson, that unity can rise from devastation, still resonates whenever nations face crisis. Conclusion. The day that lives in infamy. In the end, Pearl Harbor was more than just a devastating military strike. It was a moment of awakening for the United States and the world. It marked the end of America's isolation and the beginning of its role as a global leader. It changed warfare, international relations, and national identity forever. The voices of those who lived through it may be fading, but their memory remains. As long as people pause on December 7th, as long as the Arizona rests beneath the waves, and as long as history is taught, the lessons of that day will endure. Pearl Harbor was, and always will be, a reminder that history can turn in an instant, and that out of tragedy can come strength, unity, and resolve.